Welcome to the program today. I am Mondo Gonzales here with a prophecy update with our good friend Bill Salus. Welcome, Bill.
Hey, Mondo. It's great to be back on these programs.
There's a lot going on, and you and I spent some time doing a prophecy update really about the whole Ezekiel 38, 39 situation. We talked about, really the DVD that we had made, and also as it relates to Russia and Ukraine. But I thought it would be really good to do another prophecy update talking about what a lot of people don't realize is the dual prophecies of Iran/Elam. And I know that you have written about this before, and I think it's getting, it needs to be brought up again in the sense of, you wrote a book called The Nuclear Showdown with Iran, and you actually have a trailer for this, right?
I do. We should play it and then talk about this prophecy of Elam, ancient prophecy of Elam in Jeremiah chapter 49.
Yeah, let's play the trailer right now and take a look at this, and then when we come back, we want to really unwrap this a little bit more.
By far the most important thing today, not only today, but in a historical perspective, the most important thing is to make sure that a militant regime, a militant Islamic regime or a militant Islamic movement does not get its hands on the weapons of mass destruction.
Missiles cloud Mideast skies over the Persian Gulf. Iran shuts down the Strait of Hormuz. Arab oil is choked off to world markets. Hezbollah and Hamas launch scores of missiles into Israel. Terror cells initiate cycles of violence in America. About 2,600 years ago, the Hebrew prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel issued parallel end times prophecies concerning modern-day Iran. Today, the rogue country is becoming a nuclear nation and aggressively advancing its hegemony throughout the greater Middle East. Nuclear Showdown in Iran, revealing the ancient prophecy of Elam, is a non-fiction thriller taking the reader on a journey of discovery through the eyes of the prophets and the minds of today's key national players. But there's a backstory, an even bigger story. It's a spiritual showdown in Iran between Islam and Christianity.
Iran is being transformed into a Christian nation in this generation. Iran has the fastest growing evangelical population in the world. Iranians are experiencing miracles, healings, visions, and dreams. And with the help of satellite television, millions of them are coming to Christ. 2 years ago, Iranian government began cracking down on Christianity. But it's not working. Christianity is growing in Iran. Iran is in the Bible prophecy, and many Iranian Christians are excited about what the Bible says about the future of Iran. Please pray for your brothers and sisters in Iran.
Pick up your copy of Nuclear Showdown in Iran, revealing the ancient prophecy of Elam.
So, Bill, here we have really the trailer of the research that you've done. I think there is some confusion that I've been seeing, and people have different perspectives in the prophecy world, and we love our brothers, and we're not fighting about it. But some people think that some of the prophecies as it relates to Elam, Jeremiah 49, and other passages are done, they're gone, they're fulfilled. Talk about that a little bit as it relates to what you see as being coming in the future on the horizon as it relates to Iran/Elam. First, let's talk about where Elam is.
Right. Okay, yeah, let's kind of break it down a little bit about the prophecy, a little bit about the objections. Some people think it's already been fulfilled and we shouldn't be looking for it on the horizon. You're right. Iran has got a double jeopardy in the end times, biblically, prophetically speaking. Ezekiel, of course, in Ezekiel 38:5 talks about Iran as Persia, and Iran used to be called Persia until 1935 when it was renamed Iran. But it's not the only, when you look at a modern-day map of Iran, it is comprised historically of Persia, which is about 2/3 of Iran, but on the western side, hugging the Persian Gulf, you actually had Elam, ancient Elam, that territory, and it was always isolated and separated by the Zagros Mountains there. So Jeremiah, around 596 BC, contemporary of Ezekiel, actually writes about Elam, not Persia, Elam, in Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 34 through 39. And then about a decade or two later, Ezekiel writes about Persia. Now, Ezekiel knew about Elam, but he neglected to include Elam. I think it was intentionally omitted because of this other prophecy that happens, I think, in advance in Jeremiah. Ezekiel is very specific about the countries that are going to invade Israel in his prophecy, but he intentionally omitted some key countries like Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and this Elam territory, just to mention a few of them. And I think that was intentional because those are countries subject to their own prophecies. And Elam is the same in this particular case. And what the prophecy says, and this is why I'm watching for it, it says that in the latter days that the Lord is going to be fiercely angry with Elam, which would be modern day Iran. And because we know this because he is going to break the bow at the foremost of the might of Elam. He's going to stop them from launching something lethal somewhere. It says they've got bad leadership. He's going to destroy from there the kings and the princes. They want to launch something lethal somewhere. I think that something lethal somewhere is an ICBM, if it was in our modern day time, an ICBM with a nuclear warhead launched at Israel. And the Lord won't allow that to happen. And it says when the Lord breaks the bow of Elam at the foremost of its might, he says he will gather the four winds from the four quarters of heaven and scatter the Elamites into all those winds, meaning it's a worldwide dispersion picture. It says no nations, there still be no nations where the outcasts of Elam don't go, the refugees, the exiles. It's a worldwide dispersion. It sounds like it's brought about by a humanitarian crisis. It would cause something like that. And that is where the Bashar nuclear reactor is, and that is also that area there where the underground silos and missile launchers of Iran's ICBMs would be headed toward Israel, that area there. And so there's a nuclear reactor there, Bashar 1, Russia's building Bashar 2 and Bashar 3. And now with the Biden administration releasing $29 billion of funds for the civilian sanction funds, of the Vienna talks that are going on right now, he's agreed to release $29 billion to Iran for sanctions relief to try to entice them. It was an act of appeasement. We got nothing in return. He decided to entice Iran to try to come and restate the JCPOA of 2015, which you can't roll back that clock because Iran has already advanced in uranium enrichment and things like that at this point. So the point I'm saying is that Russia's going to now come and build Bashar 2 and Bashar 3. So that area is going to be filled with nuclear reactors over the next 4 or 5 years. It already has one, and one in itself is sufficient enough to create the humanitarian crisis we're talking about, should it be taken out. It's not necessarily a high target of Israel at this point, but when you look at the fact that it's on that western side of Israel where you have the missile launching capabilities where Iran would be coming against Israel, you can see how this thing could escalate and get out of hand, and next thing you know, the Bashar nuclear reactor becomes a nuclear disaster.
Yeah, let's talk about the scenario for a minute. So, if we were to try to put the puzzle together, we have the dual prophecy of Iran/Elam in Jeremiah 49, and then we also talk about the prophecy of Iran in Ezekiel 38. So, in the sense of understanding a potential scenario, because we're not prophets in that sense, but so maybe there's a nuclear showdown reaction that happens down in the plains leading up to the mountains there along the coast. It kind of gets annihilated, but yet there's still the main area of Iran, right? Tehran's over there on the other side. So Iran still is in existence, but weakened, and then maybe is drawn out through the solicitation and its connections with Russia in a later Ezekiel 38, 39 situation. Is that kind of the idea?
Right. There's been studies done by the Arab countries across the Gulf that talk about should there be a nuclear disaster caused by an earthquake or whatever to the Bashar nuclear reactor, because 2/3 of the world's desalination plants are in those Arab countries over there by the Persian Gulf there. And they're very concerned. They're rich in oil, but they're poor in water. If something happened there, they realized that in 15 hours or so, they could have 40% to 100% of their populations detrimentally affected by that. And yet Tehran would not necessarily be as affected because of the Zagros Mountains that would prevent the fallout, that sort of bottle it up and send it. The winds would then send them across the Gulf over to the west toward those Arab countries, the GCC countries over there. So Iran the prophecy of Jeremiah is not dealing with Persia. It's dealing with Elam. And what happens is Persia, I believe, if this is going to precede Ezekiel 38, which I believe it does, in the book, the Nuclear Showdown book, which Prophecy Watchers has, revealing the ancient prophecy of Elam, I put forward the fact that Ezekiel 38 and Jeremiah 49 are not the same prophecies, the Elam prophecy, Persia and Elam. I give the reasons for that, so that we invite the viewer to get their hands on that and the DVD that goes with it. But the point is, Persia still stays intact, and Russia would come to Iran's rescue, like you're making that point.
Yeah.
And I think that I don't want to put much stock into this, but when you look at Ezekiel 38, 1 through 6, the list of the Magog invaders, right at the top, you've got Russia and Turkey. Then honorable mentions are given down around verse 5 near Ethiopia and putting Cush down there to Persia. Now, is that because maybe Iran at that point has been compromised? I don't know, but I don't read more into it than we should. But I do believe this is a prophecy in Elam that we should be looking for. And it's been one of the most vastly ignored prophecies and dismissed prophecies, I think, of our time. And I think it could be the next one to happen.
You know, last time we talked, which was, I don't know, 6 to 8 weeks ago or whatever, but a lot has happened in the time in that, you know, Israel, or maybe share with the audience, if you will, some of the steps that Israel has taken over the last couple months, because they had gone to the United Nations. They had said, you know, when the Vienna talks were happening, that's kind of when we had our previous conversation. What are some of the things that they've done in the meantime?
Well, Mondo, I think the thing with Israel is it's been operating under a covert scenario for quite a while. You know, they tried to hack into the Stuxnet virus and slow down the nuclear program in 2010 time. Then they were killing some nuclear scientists back around that time. They even assassinated a nuclear scientist within the last couple of years over there. They've done things over there now covertly, but they're going to have to move overtly. And we've seen explosions going on at the Natanz reactor and things like that, which has Israel's fingerprints on it. I don't know how much more covert activity they can do. They are preparing with drills and things for overt action. And even though the JCPOA may now be reinstated, I'm not saying it will be because of Biden's appeasement move with $29 billion, Israel remains the right outside of that agreement to do what they have to do. And Naftali Bennett has been in conversations with President Joe Biden to that end, basically reserving the right to do what Israel has to do to defend itself as a nation, because Iran wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And they've made that statement clear and concise many times in the past, to Ahmadinejad, to Ayatollah Khomeini, etc. And Israel considers Iran an existential threat, rightfully so, because Iran's got its tentacles throughout the Middle East with its proxies spread out. Its hegemony is growing. Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles pointed toward Israel. Syria's got chemical weapons. Hamas is a proxy of Iran. They're lobbing missiles. Houthis have come out recently and said, we now have ICBMs that we can get our hands on that will actually reach Tel Aviv. So now you got to throw in the Houthis way down in Yemen below Saudi Arabia into this mix. So basically, it appears that Israel is going to come to a point, I think very soon, where it's going to attack Iran. And it says that it says when the Lord gets fiercely angry in the prophecy, it says, I'm fiercely angry, and I will bring about a disaster in Iran in the latter days, it talks about. And we said, why? Because they want to launch something lethal somewhere. He's going to not allow that to happen. He gets fiercely angry, and it says a disaster will be created. And it says when a disaster is created, Elam will be dismayed before its enemies, plural. So a menu of enemies, and we're not told which ones, but I believe Israel will be one of them. And when Israel probably attacks Iran, I think this could create this nuclear disaster at that point, and Iran won't take that laying low. They will bring their proxies, excuse my French, the proxies against Israel, Hezbollah, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, the Houthis, etc. Israel is surrounded by dangerous enemies in the neighborhood. Now, none of those proxies of Iran are included in the Ezekiel 38 and 39 prophecy, and I believe that's because they're part of the Psalm 83 prophecy, and they probably get taken out in advance of the Ezekiel 38 prophecy.
You know, do you have any thoughts or opinions on, for some people that might not be aware, explain, if you will, the players. You mentioned it down at the southern tip of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. What is going on there, and who are the players? Who are the part of each axis of groups of nations?
Well, in Iran's attempt to establish a Shiite-led Islamic caliphate led by Iran, they've developed these proxies, and right now they've got the Houthis, heavily armed and dangerous, and attacking key points in Saudi Arabia, which is a Sunni country. So, that's the main player down to the south of Saudi Arabia. You would have thought, well, they're going to restrict their abilities to being just attacking Saudi Arabia, but now they're coming out saying, we don't like Israel either. We can actually, go hit rockets in Tel Aviv. Now that's alarming, because it's not like Israel doesn't have enough to deal with on its plate with Hezbollah to the north, Hamas, and Syria, Bashar al-Assad, militias, Shiite militias in Iraq. The Palestinians also are not friends with Israel. They also want that land, and so it's just a real quagmire and a mess for Israel at this point. And diplomacy is going to fail. The two-state solution is not biblically endorsed, and diplomacy is going to fail. When diplomacy fails, wars break out, and I believe the wars are epic, biblical, and prophesied.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's a cliche, but it's so true that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And you see that people might not know this, or they might, might not be familiar, but the Saudi Arabia, they're Sunnis, and they absolutely hate Iran. And so here you have Iran hates Israel, and now you see Israel and Saudi Arabia becoming much closer, as we've been discussing the Abrahamic Accords. There's been other things in motion for these alliances. How does that strengthen Israel?
Well, temporarily, I think in response to the Iran scenario specifically, dealing probably with the Iran prophecy, it's enabling Israel to get closer toward Iran, like in the UAE specifically. The relationships with Israel and the UAE are growing pretty good at this point. Now, I don't know if those will last, especially Saudi Arabia, for instance, which really isn't a member of the Abraham Accord, but they were warming up to Israel when President Trump was in office. Because Saudi Arabia actually shows up in Ezekiel 38 under the banner of Dedan. So they're a protester on the sidelines with the merchants of Tarshish and their young lions, who I believe could be the UK and the USA. The point being is that what we see going on in the Middle East right now, we can't exactly say that's going to maintain itself. At some point, this relationship with Israel and those Arab countries, they may not last. But meanwhile, Israel is seizing the opportunity to establish a stronger hold closer to Iran through the UAE.
Do you think that, well, two things. Saudi Arabia it has already, I've heard through the covert channels, has agreed to allow Israel to use their airspace for an attack on Iran. But do you think, whether that's still true or maintains, we don't know, but do you think that they might establish a stop-off point in the UAE? Because they know that's a long way to go, and that's always been, the United States denied them these tankers, these refuelers that we saw over the past few months. Could they stop off and launch maybe from the UAE?
Well, they could. It certainly would be strategic for them to do that. I don't know if the UAE wants to be sticking their chin out first, look what our friend Israel is now going to do to Iran, because they've become a quick target for Iran. Mm-hmm. One of the first places Iran would probably attack, right across the Gulf. But, it certainly strategically and logistically makes sense for Israel to strengthen those ties and deploy as much armory as they can, their jets and things like that, their drones from that area.
Well, Bill, there's so much going on in the Middle East, and I really appreciate you being here and coming on to Skype with us and to record a couple programs. And I'm very certain that we'll be talking again.
I think so, Mondo. These things are active and happening right before our eyes, and these prophecies are ancient prophecies. They're about to roll off their parchments, and we're talking about them, and I applaud prophecy watchers for doing just that.
As we end this prophecy update, this is an exciting time to be alive, and I hope that you continue to come back. Our goal here is to educate, to evangelize, to share the truths of Scripture, the prophecies of Scriptures that we get the privilege of watching. I like to end the programs with Mark 13:37, that Jesus is the one that told us to be watching in order to be ready, because we know that his return is soon, and when he finds us, he wants us. His heart is for us to be ready so that when we stand before him, it will go well with us as it relates to our rewards. We know that Jesus paid the price for our sins eternally, and that's an awesome blessing. But in the meantime, he told us to be ready for his return. So we appreciate you watching, and we will definitely see you next time.